I'm very excited to have with me today two of the finest marketing leaders I've ever had a chance to meet, Jen Grant and Stacy Epstein. So thank you very much, Jen and Stacy, for joining me.
Thank you.
Jen was a product marketeer at Google, then went on to lead marketing at Box, where she led the process of transforming a consumer backup tool into what Box has now become. She then went on to lead marketing at Elastic and Looker. At Looker, she led marketing all the way through its acquisition by Google. And she's now the CEO of Appify, which is a mobile application development platform. Welcome to FC Build, Jen.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Jen, Stacy is someone who some of you may have sort of had a chance to sort of interact with in prior foundation events. She's been a long-time supporter of the firm. She started off her career in sales at Oracle and then went on to lead marketing at SuccessFactors from the very early days through to its IPO. She then joined ServiceMax soon after it was founded. I think one of the earliest employees, if I remember rightly, Stacy.
Yeah.
And then built out the marketing function there from scratch. She then went on to become CEO of Zinc, which is a communication platform for field workers. And Zinc was then acquired back by ServiceMax. You know, in some ways they definitely wanted Stacy back. and so she's been there for the last several years as the Chief Marketing and Customer Experience Officer. So thank you for joining us again, Stacy.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm going to start off with the core question that we're going to spend time unwrapping and sort of diving into in a variety of ways. The most important topic at board meetings in the first 2 or 3 years of a company is, do we have product market fit? And, you know, it's one of those things no one has a crisp answer to, and we go back and forth. And inevitably, whenever we have this discussion, the movie that I see playing out is, what does product market fit actually mean? And so I'd love for both of you, given your experiences, to give us your definition of what is product market fit, and then how do you know you have it? Stacy, maybe you can kick it off.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's actually a pretty simple answer. For me, it's the value proposition is compelling enough that a lot of people will buy it. I mean, it's, you know, I think we could, and certainly we'll spend a lot of time today talking about it. I mean, that is a statement with a lot behind it, but that's really ultimately what it is. Is there enough value that makes it compelling for a company, I mean, you know, it's always a person behind a company if it's an enterprise sale, or if it's a consumer play, then it is usually an individual, but will someone shell out money and pay for it, and not just like a handful of people or companies, but a significant number of people. And obviously, like, the amount of people is part of what you need to figure out. But I mean, honestly, it's a pretty simple concept.
Thanks. And that's a good kickoff to, I think, the discussion of sort of unbundling what that could mean. Jenna, before we move further, I'd love to get your perspective. What's your definition?
Yeah, and I think I'll say everything Stacy said, and I'll just add on to it. As I've been thinking about product market fit in my own business, it's the reason I think it's such a complicated but yet simple question is, how do you know? And so that, you know, and then that's when you get, okay, well, how do you know? So then how do you define? And so the one thing I would add to it, there's been a lot of writing around, you know, how do you measure product market fit, especially in enterprise software where things take longer. And there were two sort of schools of thought that I've looked into. And one of them is, I believe it was a blog post written about surveys and saying, you know, how sad would you be if you didn't have this product anymore? And I'll say on that side, I'm not a fan of surveys, because I think you fall into the same trap of like, well, it's really a nice product and I like you guys, which is not product market fit. I think on the flip side, this is where sort of data comes in my background at Looker, and being able to really instrument a product so that you have the data to say that a customer is actually using it and it becomes stuck in their business in some sort of important way. And so when you think about product market fit, like, yes, it is a big enough market to support a business. That's sort of, kind of what Stacey was saying. And then are they actually using it is really the question you want to answer. And that's been sort of my kind of focus on, like, how do we get that product usage data so that we can see real usage from, people in the business, not like, hey, this is this fun toy that we're playing with.
It's interesting. Sorry, go on, Stacey.
I was just going to say, I totally agree. I think that goes back to the value word, right? Like,
yeah,
even if they do buy it, but they're not getting value out of it, that doesn't, like, it, that you need them to be getting value, because that's what you build on for other customers. So you might get lucky and have someone pay for it for who knows what reason. But if there isn't any value and they don't see that value, then I agree with you. Like, that's not product market fit.
Right.
And that's what makes this question so interesting, because there's a dimension around, is there demand? I've heard people talk about product market fit is when demand is, customers are pulling at the product, and there's more demand than in some ways you would see in the normal course. There's this notion of value, Stacey, that you talked about, and this notion, Jen, you talked about, sort of engagement with the product. The other dimension of product market fit, especially for enterprise companies, is around the company's ability to actually sell it. One of my CEOs, Mohit Aaron, always says, you have product market fit when the average salesperson out in the field, hundreds of miles away from headquarters, can sell it to the average customer out in Texas or North Carolina, and not to the bleeding edge customers sort of up and down 101.
Yeah.
Now that's a very high bar. Very often you don't get that bar until you have 100 customers.
Yeah.
But curious, sort of, how do you sort of factor in the company's ability to sell and the notion of repeatability in your definitions of product market fit? And Jen, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, given that you saw that journey very early on at Box as they were making that transition from a consumer app to an enterprise company.
Yeah, and it made me the first thing it made me think when you talked about selling to Silicon Valley, I would say the first play at Looker that we had was SDRs were calling down. Basically, we go to every VC website and call the portfolio.
And definitely the VCs you were pitching to.
Yeah, which of course helps, with your fundraising.
Of course.
You can call, everybody's using you. Yes, everyone, as in the Valley. And it was a very effective play. And it because it combined, people who care about data with companies small enough that they could buy quickly. But the reality is, we had product market fit with these sort of bleeding edge companies, but we needed to build a business that was much more on larger, more stable companies. And that was a big focus at Looker. We called them VBTs, venture-backed tech. Like, how do we shift away from venture-backed tech as much as we want to serve them? Because there's no real company that is going to buy a heavyweight business intelligence solution that is a 15-person company. That's not the persona that we were going to sell to in any other industry.
Yep.
But we could sell the crap out of it up and down the valley. So it was a really good example you used. It reminded me of that. Now, of course, it doesn't hurt to make money off of that particular segment while you're spending more time, especially in enterprise and sales. It takes longer to sell. So if you can get those quick wins with these bleeding edge people, that'll put some cash in the bank while you learn how to do the bigger ones. And I'd say at Box, we had, we really were starting with smaller companies because the product was more lightweight than Looker. And so we had, all these free users who were sort of saving their baby photos or music or whatever it was. And that shift, I think, right when I started at Box was when that product market fit was beginning to appear, in that we started to meet with all the customers and they would tell us stories about what we had done that was helpful to them. And of course, and we're going to talk about this later, sort of the marketing and messaging. The irony of the whole thing is Aaron Levy, he's this wonderful speaker, CEO. He's talking about Fortune 500, the file server, the cloud, like these big visionary, we're going to take out SharePoint, all of this stuff. The reality is the product market fit we found was replacing FTP systems, sending big files, and this sort of project collaboration. And it, it wasn't that sexy, but that was okay because we were delivering value. People were uploading files. We could see in the data they were deeply using the product. Like, sell more of that, and then we'll get bigger and bigger.
You'll expand out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Stacey, I want to come to you because this topic of finding product market fit with venture-backed companies is a strategy that's not uncommon in the Valley. But both at ServiceMax and SuccessFactors, I suspect you had to go to enterprise much earlier, given the nature of those businesses. So can you talk a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I mean, actually, both of those companies were enterprise businesses from the start, and honestly, our bigger challenge was being successful down market as we grew. But let me tie in something that you said earlier too, which is that I think a lot of companies make a mistake in confusing demand with product market fit, especially early stage. If you go back to, I can talk about either of those companies, SuccessFactors or ServiceMax. It's probably true with your companies too, Jen.
Yep.
Were HR people back in 2004 saying, what I really need is a SaaS-based performance management system. Like, where is one? I'm going to look. Like, that's demand, right? They don't even know what that value is. They're just mired in their problems of manually tracking a huge performance management problem in a big company. And so, no, there is no inbound demand, zero. Like, we had to create all of that demand, but it doesn't mean there wasn't product market fit. Again, the value proposition of the solution is compelling enough that people will pay for it. So I do sometimes get frustrated when I hear this, well, like, how much demand is there? And especially for early stage, obviously when you get later and people know who you are, then they're more synonymous. But I think that's really what it was for us. I think we pretty much knew we had product market fit very, very early. And if I look at, I was like 10 million in ARR when I joined SuccessFactors, which is still pretty darn early. At ServiceMax, I was employee 14. We didn't even have $1 million in revenue. But we knew that field service is mission critical for the companies that have field service teams. We knew that they were always looking for ways to reduce costs. It was newer that they were able to also drive revenue and become a profit center. And a solution in the cloud would enable both of those things. And field service people are innately mobile. And so you can't really, what are you going to do? Put an on-prem solution on every one of their, it's just SaaS enabled so many things for that industry. And so under $1 million in revenue, we knew we had product market fit. And then it was just all about go-to-market strategy. So I think, that's not always the case. You may be doing something so new that the market doesn't even understand it at all. But I think, it just keeps coming back to me, like, you have to understand the value to the audience and to the buyer. And if there is no value, and if they don't agree that there's enough value that they're going to drive an ROI out of it, then you don't have product market fit.
Jen, maybe you could sort of, what Stacey, so the distinction Stacey made around sort of demonstrating that you have true value, especially in categories where you're not replacing something, it's a new category. So there isn't going to be inbound demand because people aren't typing in, I want a performance management system. It's not something they think about every day when they wake up. So I think there's a distinction between demand for new customers versus I have customers that are getting value. I now need to find more of the same. I think it's an important one.
Yeah.
And it's one that people mix up all the time. We have this discussion, and a lot of, I think the demand part is sort of, and we'll come to it, is a question of how do you position in a way that you can drive demand gen now to repeat this product market fit with more and more customers. So maybe you could talk about the early days of Box and the transition you guys made there.
Yeah.
About the story.
Yeah, because I think Box is a great example, similar to ServiceMax, in that there wasn't really a market for cloud content sharing. You know, what is this? I'm not necessarily looking for this. And I think, you know, there are different types of businesses that have different issues. So, you know, in contrast, Looker was in BI and there's a bazillion BI. So that was more of a differentiation. Whereas Box, we needed to focus our energy on telling the story of what this thing was, and a lot of category creation, a lot of thinking about, you know, industry analysts, what is Gartner and Forrester? We don't fit in any of these MQs. How do we influence them to, you know, what this thing is that we're doing? I remember, you know, talking to Gartner, and they had, I believe it was called ECM, which is Enterprise Content Management. And their list of things were all about on-prem.
And you didn't check any of those boxes, and you didn't want to check those boxes because you were not going to become an on-prem company.
We were like, right, we can do none of these things, but that's a good thing. And so having that conversation to say, we need to be changing how you need to either come up with another MQ, or you got to rethink how you're evaluating these things, because you're doing it based on kind of the old world. So, and I know all the entrepreneurs are like, oh yes, the old world and Gartner, because that's where they come from. So I mean, I think that whether you're in a market that is already got an established thing like business intelligence, that's where you can sort of, you know, go on content digital marketing. You're like, people are looking for it, so you get in and you tell your story of why you're different. Or if you're in a completely new market, like we were at Box, it needs to have much more thought leadership, much more sort of telling the big transformational story of the industry. And I believe that's where ServiceMax and, you know, what Stacey did there was so critical, is like, that was a story that nobody else was telling. That was a market that didn't exist. And so creation of a market has different tactics and different things to create that demand versus, you know, kind of you have a differentiated product functionality that's going into a market that already exists.
Absolutely.
There are pros and cons of both.
And Stacey, you've sort of been in flavors of both, because at you know, Success Factors in the early days, you were selling the dream of the cloud. I mean, the cloud is, you know, which is now we all take for granted, wasn't a thing at all. And obviously it was very different by the time sort of you started to scale ServiceMax. So maybe you can compare and contrast your experiences in the two companies.
Yeah, I mean, let's stick with the category creation concept. At Success Factors, there was no category. There was, you know, people were doing performance and talent management on, you guys probably remember it. Like, here's the Word document, fill it out and email it in. So there was literally no category. So we spent a lot of time on category creation. What do we call it? How big is it? Are we going to include the recruiting vendors in it? Because we're going to do that someday. How much does it go into the employee record as part, like, and then we literally just like pushed the analysts to like, this is how it's defined. This is what we're doing. Didn't you know that? And it was an analyst and press category creation to create what is now called talent management. ServiceMax was different though. Their field service management, I mean, you know, if you want to go really far back in my early 20s, I was selling field service management at Clarify. You know, back when
I remember that,
no cloud, but we were one of many companies across many industries that came on. It's just like exactly what Salesforce did to Siebel, right? Let me just come in and kind of take what you've done and put it in the cloud, and then take advantage of all the things that you can do in the cloud that you couldn't do on-prem. And that's our category. But CRM existed before Salesforce.
Long before.
So that's a different thing, right? We're not like pushing the analysts to create the category, but there was, I mean, like Jen, you brought back some memories of like, you know, Gartner quadrants where you got more points if you also offered an on-prem solution, even if you were just like trying to build something in the cloud on the side, then, it counted that you offered both. And it's like, no, the whole value props around being in the cloud, like, don't dock us because we don't offer some on-prem solution. I mean, that was happening not that long ago. So, I do think that there's different, are you creating a new category? Actually, are you just reinvigorating an existing category? And does that mean you need to rename it or, have an adjacent category? That's a lot of complexity, but that is also the fun part of early to mid-stage marketing.
Absolutely. And in fact, what both of you touched upon has been one of the common themes across the last day and a half, which is multiple founders and multiple early execs have said, in the early days, it's very tempting to play by the rules of the incumbents. And so, Ali at Databricks, and, we were talking to Ali, and he talked about how he made one of his, regrets is early on, he agreed to do an on-prem version for a very, very large customer. For what was otherwise, and it's just one customer, but they signed a multi-year deal. They negotiated hard, and he's like, that deal was a rock for years to come because we had to support something that we never wanted to support. In contrast, George Kurtz actually just earlier today talked about how he walked away from what was one of the largest deals early in the history of CrowdStrike because a large Swiss bank said, we'll never go to the cloud. That's not for us. And hold and behold, 2 years later, they signed up because, they came around. So I do think that's a hard balance. It's a hard balance for every company to find. I want to sort of switch to one of the audience questions that's come up. And Jen, I'll, maybe ask you to start on this one. Both your companies started off in the SMB market in some ways and moved up market over time. That's true for Box and that's true for Looker. One of the audience questions is around how do you manage that transition? And even if you have product market fit in the SMB market, as you move up market, how do you know you have product market fit and how do you make that transition?
Yeah, and I think that goes to something you had said as we were prepping for this conversation is that there isn't sort of the one product market fit. You're not done. And so when you think about in the example of Box, we had product market fit with these sort of very unsexy use cases. So, sell the crap out of that. Yes. But then at the same time, we had our CEO and our PR and our big message around taking out SharePoint. And that was sort of not necessarily product market fit. We had certainly not proved that, but we were selling a vision that then we could start to move up. And so have those conversations with larger companies to say, this could be the central file system of your business. And this is what the cloud does for you. Here are the advantages, which of course we were peppering with this top of the funnel kind of PR and awareness that we were doing on the top. So you can the way I've described it is you build the inside sales machine. In the case of SMB to enterprise, you build that machine to be as efficient as possible to repeat this sort of less sexy selling so that you can sit on that revenue and start pushing into the mid-market, the enterprise, and you start getting those bigger accounts where you can't really say that you have product market fit in the enterprise yet, but you're starting to build the case studies that will get you to product market fit. In the case of Box, we had this really early deal with P&G, and we worked with this small group. I think it was their baby group or their diaper group. And it was for a very project oriented. They wanted to store all their files in one project folder. Super simple. But we were talking to their innovative IT folks. And then, 3 years later.
Typical enterprise sales cycle.
We went with P&G. But it was like, you couldn't have said, oh, you have product market fit at, large consumer packaged goods companies. Not at all. We had a tiny little inroad that was more like an SMB. That's how they acted. And then that gave us access to have this really long conversation around what do we need to build from a product perspective, security, scalability, make IT happy, the certifications, all of the stuff that an enterprise required, and they pulled us into a larger deployment 2 years
but
later.
I think
It took a
you're
long
making
time.
a very important point.
That was
Sorry, I want to reiterate the point, which is for companies that are going from SMB to large enterprise, very often the way to find product market fit in large enterprises is do departmental sales, because those departmental sales look very SMB-ish.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was even true for Microsoft when Microsoft built out the SQL Server business. And I'm horribly dating myself now, but the SQL Server, which today powers some of the largest companies in the world, no one would think that was an alternative to Oracle 15 years ago. And it was departmental sale by departmental sale that then allows you to sort of earn the right to do the large enterprise deals over time. Stacy, now you alluded to the fact that earlier in this discussion that at ServiceMax and SuccessFactors you had to do some of the opposite, because that's equally hard. When you have large enterprise deals and they're driving the business and you want to sort of move down market, can you talk a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about it maybe specific to ServiceMax since it's more recent, and we pretty much don't sell to small business anymore, and our mid-market is pretty high. And I think for us, a lot of it had to do with the implementation. There's a lot of configuration / customization / mapping. Like the field service process is a complicated one. And our biggest issue was getting a price that would work. And we could cut the price of the product and make that work. But the implementation was harder to do. And then we get into the area of like too much service versus product in the sale, which is, we did not want to be a services company. And then you try to box up a best practices implementation, and then you get into trouble because they always want more. And so honestly, our struggle getting down market was finding a pricing scheme that worked for us and for them. And then the other thing is it ended up taking just as long. Again, these are mission critical departments of a company. They can't just swap out their change overnight. And so it takes it's also a risk averse audience. So the sales cycle just takes a long time, and we couldn't make it, the CAC was just way too high for the SMB. So we pretty much abandoned it. I mean, we sell to mid-market companies now. We do have a best practice implementation. But our target market just continues to be those big elephant deals that fund our business. So sometimes it's just to go down market.
I think what you said resonates so much. I mean, I remember earlier in my career, I worked with a sales leader who said, the thing about mid-market, and this was in a company where we had very large deals, tens of millions of dollars deals, and we were looking at sort of going mid-market. And he said, the problem is mid-market customers have the budget of small customers and the needs and aspirations of the largest customers. And that's where you get stuck. They have those same expectations of service and support and sort of feature development, but without that budget. So in many cases, it's just not the right thing for a company to do.
And your earlier comment about like looking what everybody else is doing, we sort of are largely in CRM. So you look at Salesforce and you say, well, they've been really successful with an SMB strategy. Like, why are we not the same? But again, the if we boil it down to the core capabilities, if you look at a sales process, it's all pretty much the same. It's a lead, it gets converted to an opportunity, it goes through some stages, it's a win, expand that out to the Service Cloud call center, it's a case, those are all very, very common processes across basically all verticals.
All companies, yeah.
Field service is just not that way.
Right.
They all do it very differently. They have very different processes. And that's where we had to make sure we weren't just saying, well, if they do it, then why can't we do it, and keep throwing money at it and wasting time and money.
That's super helpful. So I'm about to shift gears to sort of talking about sort of hiring your first VP of marketing which is an important topic that I wanted to sort of dive in, given that both of you have experienced that on both sides of the table in that conversation, and talk a little bit about positioning. But before we do that, any advice, maybe as a parting sort of advice on the topic of product market fit for the founders out there who are struggling with this question, who are somewhere in that $0 to $3-4 million range and are struggling? If either of you have advice for them on think about X or do Y, sort of what's one takeaway that you would share?
I would say my one takeaway is really getting that product usage data, because that's the real, like, are they really using it? You can't get more real than that. That would be my,
data, yeah.
And like, do I have that at my company? But like, fight for it. Because I know it's very easy to, we're building this feature and that feature and this feature. We don't have time to instrument for product usage data. Like, we've got to build, and it's critical. You have to know if people are using it.
What about you?
I would totally agree with that. I will add, and you touched on this earlier, really trying to understand if you have a product market fit problem or you have a sales execution problem. And it's really easy to throw money at hiring sales and saying, oh, well, that, gosh, I didn't hire the right VP yet again. I got to fire him or her and bring someone new in. And these reps aren't any good. And really, you have a product market fit problem. So really, and it's hard. Like, I remember that, it was constantly like, what do we need to fix here? Is it product market fit or is it sales execution? And there, every board meeting we were talking about that. So I would say really get a handle on that, because you could spend a lot of money and time and shorten your runway if you are trying to solve a sales execution problem and you actually have a product market fit problem that nobody can sell.
Very well said. And I see that again and again, because it's so much easier to blame the salesperson or the demand gen person than acknowledge that, look, we have a more fundamental problem in strategy because the product itself isn't delivering the value that customers want. And I think that's a great segue to sort of the discussion around hiring your first VP of marketing, because, once you have product market fit, you probably have a sales leader, because people go hire a sales executive early on. The next question is, how do I make this more repeatable and scalable? And that's where your first VP of marketing hire comes in. And it's an extraordinarily hard hire. And both of you have been that person multiple times very successfully, and have been CEOs who've had to hire VPs of marketing for yourself. So maybe, Jen, you could start and talk a little bit about what advice would you have for a founder that's looking to hire their first VP of marketing? What should they look for?
Yeah, and I think I get this question a lot. Oh, is it a product marketing person, or is it a brand person, or is it demand gen? Are they data driven? And I think typically founders in the early stage will say, oh, demand gen, if only I had leads, everything would be better.
Magically solved if you have leads.
There are the leads will just fly in. I think there are a small number of companies where they would ask me that question. I would say, you need a demand gen person. Those are the companies that have already discovered that key value proposition, or the positioning statement, that whatever their product is so clear. I had a friend of mine who had started a company. He said, oh, we don't have problem getting, we just put an ad that says, this one sentence, and people come. And I was like, okay, well, then you don't have a product marketing problem. You just need to blow up your demand gen, and you need to put that message in as many places and go. But it's very rare that will be my answer, because the majority of cases, and keeping it in mind that people in B2C don't usually ask me for advice. Yes, this is B2B. Is that it is a product marketing. You need someone who can crystallize the value proposition of what you're selling, so that your audience goes, oh, I need that. Because it's never easy in technology. It's, founders typically will love to talk about great example. Looker, the real true value proposition was, well, we have this LookML. It's this layer. It's a semantic layer on top of your data. No. You need a product marketer to turn that into something that matters to the business, or to the person, like, why does this make their life better? Why does it make their business more successful? And yes, the reason is because of this amazing semantic layer and this
So you
technology.
would start with the product marketer, it sounds like, Jen. That would be your starting point. 9 times out of 10, but not 10 times out of 10. What about you, Stacey? Where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much totally agree with everything Jen said. I just did a session at SaaStr like 2 days ago on how to build your early marketing department, and I agree. It really does depend on where are you in the journey. If you already have product market fit, then yeah, pour fuel on it. Go take that and generate demand. But for most companies that are just building their marketing team and they're hiring their first leader, they probably aren't there yet. And you need somebody who can research, analyze, look at that usage data, talk to customers, create positioning. Like, that's likely what you need. The other thing I will add that we actually talked about a lot on Tuesday, because it was kind of an interactive session, was don't forget culture. Don't forget that leader is an early stage leader in your company, and it isn't just about, are they going to be a great marketer? You got to make sure that they fit in, that you're very aligned with them, that you can, spend the time to infuse your vision into what they're doing. It's a key leadership hire that as you're building your culture, you want to pay attention to that also.
Yeah, absolutely. And every leader, early at that stage is either going to is going to change your culture for good or for bad. And you just have to acknowledge that. In addition to culture, I mean, the question that, so I think most founder CEOs will say, okay, I get it. I should hire a product marketeer. How do I know if someone's good at that? Because I don't know most CEOs don't know anything about product marketing. They're like, I don't even know what that word means for a large part. That's what most CEOs, end up, when I can read a book on it, or I read an article. Do you have any tips or tricks for CEOs looking to hire a VP of marketing that has, a spike in product marketing?
I've actually recommended that people ask the candidate to explain the positioning behind whatever, the last 2 companies, the last 3 companies, whatever obviously they're going to have some sort of deep experience, to explain why the positioning that they did for that particular product was the right one. And just listen for that crystal, I get what.
So have them tell the story. And, if you as CEO can get the story, and there's a couple of them, hopefully, that's a good start. Stacey, what about you? I mean, you dealt with this at Zinc. I know you and I had lots of conversations. Positioning in a complicated market wasn't easy.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say, I mean, I've made my fair share of hiring mistakes. So even if you fully understand marketing, it doesn't mean that you can see into the future of, we all know that somebody can seem really great in an interview process and then they come on board and it's not a fit. So, as we were discussing earlier, like, it is a hot market right now. So people are in demand. It makes it even harder, not to scare everyone, but like, those good product marketers are in high demand. I think for me, I have just come to, you have to find people that have worked with them. And hopefully you have people in your network, or, once, maybe twice removed. That's really, to me, the only way of really understanding, unless they've done a name brand product and you can actually see the work they've done. But I just think talking to other people and really understanding their value, I put a lot of weight onto that.
So it's the referencing and deep referencing, because they're CEOs of, CEOs, peers, people who work for them. I think that makes a ton of sense.
And also, like Jen said, if you're a product marketer, you've created a lot of work. You've created positioning. You've created content. I would love to see, okay, show me the last pitch deck you did, and talk to me about your process for putting it together, and convince me about that. So I think, especially in demand gen, it's a little harder to show work. But product marketing, they're creating stuff. So look at their stuff.
Yeah. So I think this is a good segue to the question around positioning. As the founder, you're starting to figure out positioning for the company even before you have your first marketing executive, because you're the one selling it. You're the one sort of going through this process of finding product market fit, and then of course that continues to evolve over time. The challenge is that for very technical companies, most positioning statements sound a little bit like an alphabet soup. They don't make much. I've been in these. We used to do these sessions where you would have 10 founders come in early stage and all pitch their companies. And, I had one in security last year. This was before, when you still did in-person events. And I have to tell you, and I invest a lot in security, I couldn't tell the difference between the 10 at the end of that session. They sounded all the same, exactly the same. And it's a real challenge. So, do you have ideas or suggestions for founders who are trying to figure out positioning? How do they go about it?
I think it's critical to understand the competitors in your market. So if you step back and say, and I will say, there's part of me that says just wait till you get to your product marketing person in the team, because as a founder, it's really hard to extract back and to step back from your love of what you've created and say, nobody's ever heard of me. I'm for nothing. What do they think is going out there right now? What are the different aspects of competitors, or even if a competitor is do nothing, assuming I don't exist, and then say, okay, and now when I jump into this mix, where do I fit? I think there's also the mistake of thinking positioning is a tagline and it's some sort of simple 4 words that will do. It's never quite that simple, but it really is step back and what is there when you are not in the picture, and then how do you drive a wedge somewhere in that picture that solves some sort of problem that the entire sort of map has.
Yeah, I mean, I totally, once again, totally agree. I think there's a framework for positioning, and it starts with who, what, and why are we, right? What's our mission? What's our vision? And then it immediately goes to our audience. And audience is multiple audience. And I would argue that Ashu, you are one audience. Yep. I may have a completely different pitch to a buyer than I have to you. In fact, I should.
I remind startup CEOs of that all the time, that your VC pitch and your customer pitch may sound very different because they're buying different things. The VC is buying a 10-year vision, and what's this company going to be if it becomes a unicorn, whereas customers are, what are you going to do for me today?
Right. Well, and the motivations are different, and that's part of it. Like, I need to understand who's my audience, what are their motivations, what are they trying to do, what are they trying to solve, blah, blah, blah. And then that's when you create the value proposition. Then you have to describe the capabilities that you have that support that value proposition. You have to talk about how you do it differently than everybody else. You have to give examples and have a narrative, which is what I think a lot of people miss in positioning. It's all about features that solve problems, and there's no narrative. And that's why people say, well, I don't get why you're different, because you just listed 20 features and they all listed 20 features. Yeah. Like, the narrative is what brings it home. So those to me all are in, you could do a very high level messaging framework, which is your positioning. And then you can take it to verticals and you verticalize it. You can change it by audience. You can segment it, enterprise, small. I'm solving different problems for the enterprise than I solve for small. But once you get centered on that, then that is what gets used across your entire marketing organization, right? That's what you use for your playbooks for sales. That's what you use when you're launching your integrated campaigns and you have different themes that map to the positioning. But you've got to have that core understanding of who you are, who you're selling to, what's the value prop, what are the features that support it, what are the competitive differentiators, and then what is the narrative that brings it home for someone.
Well, maybe, as we start to wrap up, if each of you have one example of a positioning that you really love, of a company that you look at, and it could be one that you came up with or one that you admire, that, you know, when you first saw it, it sort of magically clicked for you?
Well, I'll give two examples because the one where I saw it and was like, oh, so good, was Calendly. They were so very specific on their homepage. It says, stop the email back and forth. And I was like, oh, yes, that speaks exactly to me. This is exactly what I want in my life. And, you know, good job. And then the second one I'll speak of is Box, because I think people often forget Calendly is luckily it can be a simple positioning. But in case of Box, we were sort of dual positioning. So we were positioning against, the simplest way to think about it is we had Dropbox and SharePoint. And so we had to address two sort of market movers. And what I always felt was so good about the positioning was we were a solution that made both IT and end users happy, because we had simple, so that made the users happy, and secure, which made IT happy, sharing. And then eventually we said collaboration, but it was simple, secure sharing that both IT and end users love and adopt. So that sort of dual, our positioning was, we solve the problem. This has a problem, that has a problem. We bring it together and solve for both. And I thought it was clever. And that this is one piece of advice for founders is they often get sick of hearing the same pitch. And if you hear Aaron Levy speak today, this is like 9 years later, there are underpinnings of that original positioning that still exist when he talks about the product and what it does for companies. And so remember that it's core and it will stick with you, so you can't get sick of it.
Stacey, you want to, before we wrap up, one example that comes to mind that you love?
Yeah, I love the Calendly one. There's a lot of really clever bite-sized ones like that out there that I know, plays on words that, I wish I had thought in advance, because there have been some that I've seen recently that I can't remember right now. I'm going to remember them right after this, but I'll go back to the story I told about ServiceMax, and our tagline in the early days was rethink field service. And there was so much we could do with that, which is like everybody always thought of field service as this cost center, just a lot of pain and processes and a kind of a drag on the organization. And that is what we wanted to change, like turn your view of field service into a profit center, a place where the leader has a seat at the table. And it really resonated with our audience because they'd been wanting to do that for
aspirational,
right? Like, so aspirational for them. And they were like, yeah, we want our company to rethink us. We're the bright spot of the team, not the like drag on the bottom line. So it really works. It doesn't work as well now. We had to kind of move away from it because now cloud, there's multiple cloud solutions on the market, and now they are thought of as a profit center. So we had to evolve. But in the early days, we did a ton with that whole like throw out everything you ever thought about field service and rethink what it can be in your organization.
I think those are wonderful examples, and we have so many audience questions that we haven't been able to get to that we could continue this for, I think, another hour. But thank you so much, Jen and Stacey, for your time. This has been a fabulous conversation on product market fit, and then more broadly on sort of building your marketing team and how do you position your product.